gender requires an ongoing and always urgent vigilance. Because without vigilance, without a sense of protecting and promoting the rights of women and girls, we know that the natural gravity and physics of patriarchy and the ways culture devalues women all around the world, unless we are able to arrest that, we are going to see even further setbacks. So we've got work to do, and that's what this day is about.
So well said. So Darren, you and Ford say that inequality is at the root of every injustice. Can you talk a little bit about how gender-based violence is connected to so many issues of injustice and inequality that you and Ford are tackling every day?
Well, you know, I was thinking about, I just got off a plane from Brazil, I love how to think, and I was thinking about this topic, and I often reflect on my lived experience, because I think each and every one of us in this room, we have a lived experience. Yes, we may have a title in the Ford Foundation, but I understand this issue, and I'm reminded of it because on the plane I was working on my memoir, which the people at Random House, I'm sure, are going to sue me because they know me here. But part of the reason for my delay is because the hardest part of the book is the opening, and I've rewritten it, and the reason it's so challenging is because my editor asked me to reflect. My mother was clearly the most influential person in my life, a single woman, poor, grew up in just an awful situation. But I remember my first impression of my mother, and we all have our first impressions of our parents, when they conjure up in our heads in that cloudy way in which we can bring from the recesses of our memory those first moments when we saw our parents. And my first memory of my mother was of her being beaten by the man we were living with as I was a small boy at that time. And he beat her because he was angry that she hadn't cooked for him in time for him as he came home from work. Now, granted, she was working full time too. I say that to say that these issues of poverty, of the ways in which cultures dehumanize women and devalue women are so intertwined and interconnected. We may live in a world of lanes, public health or economics or development in some way. But the way my mother lived her life was the way most poor Black women and most poor women everywhere. It was intersectional before we knew what intersectional was.
That's right. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's painful and poignant and very human. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room can unfortunately relate to this. Monica, I want to shift to you. So we heard in the opening film, which by the way was voiced by Tanisha McHarris of the Black Feminist Fund, shout out to her, that the rates of gender-based violence are unfortunately increasing. And we saw some of the reasons flash by, but I want to ask you about two of them. First, what can you tell us about what we know now about the impact COVID has had
Well, first of all, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. If you are tuning in to our live stream, it's great to be here in conversation, and I'm obviously very, very honored to be here with Darren. You always give me strength, so thank you for that. And that is not because he's my boss. That's a relationship before that. But it's something strange to say, but you have a way to give strength quietly in a manner that you might not recognize. So just to say that, I will say these are very, very difficult moments. You know, if we are watching TV, we are watching the images of Morocco, we are watching the images of Sudan, we are watching the images in Tunisia, we are watching the images in many places around the world. You know, and what COVID did was expose some of those images in a more stark manner to us. So to me, I think that we are making a greater effort to document, perhaps to listen, to understand what is happening, but the problem has always been there. And unfortunately, we haven't dedicated enough resources and enough attention and enough systematic intervention for us to be able to address some of those things. But I also think that it is important to recognize that the other thing that COVID did to us is come to the realization that perhaps we are not working together. You know, we saw that on the question of vaccination. We saw that on many other things that were happening and coming across our own minds and sights and feelings. And it is really important. So two things. The problem was there, it's happening, it has been happening. We're not working together, and we need to do more in terms of systematic intervention.
We'll get into some of that. But one thing that you've talked about is what you describe as the anti-rights movement. That's happening all over the world. In places like Uganda, which are passing laws that make it illegal to be LGBTQ, and even here in America, which obviously is eliminating the right to abortions. So this is a very big question, but globally, if you can help just contextualize what is happening in 30 seconds or less.
Everything is happening.
Just a little question, small.
Well, I think that we are seeing our autonomy to our body is stripped away. We are seeing the manipulation of culture. We are seeing the manipulation of religion. We are seeing the manipulation of politics. And it's all going to our own bodies, to those ones who have vagina and those ones who don't. You know, it's happening in front of us. You know, we are seeing how there are institutions, leaders, narratives out there that are willing to trade the rights of women, girls, and gender non-conforming individuals. And we are seeing that in a manner that we have not seen before. And why are we seeing that? It's because those movements are being funded, and they're being funded in a way that we in the feminist movement and others in other movements are not being funded. So I think that it is important to recognize that this is a time for us to, again, work together, put resources behind the things that we believe, and recognize how urgent the situation is. Because if we don't, not in 7 generations, in 2 years, in 3 years, we will be sitting here and seeing more rights being eroded. from our own lives. So I think it is really, really important to recognize the urgency and the level of organization that is happening to those ones who are not defending justice and rights. That's not to say that it's not important for us to create a table that is big enough to be sitting and being in conversations with those ones we don't agree with politically. That's different. You know? And in order for us to create that table, we don't necessarily have to compromise and give in our values. We have to be able to move beyond this discourse of polarization and dichotomy and breaking apart. It's hard, but I think that it is very, very important.
And can I just add to Monica's, I think, spot on explication. Inequality globally is a driver because economic inequality has implications for social inequality and cultural inequality. It gives currency to those who have always been just beneath the veneer in any country, in any region, to be empowered. Because when inequality happens, people are often looking for some group to scapegoat, to blame. That's one thing. Another, Monica says, feminist groups are not being funded. We need to also understand, and we have not understood, just to be clear, I'll put my own institution in this category. We have not understood the power of cultural currency. And what I mean by that is, I just returned from Brazil. I'm going next month to East Africa. The thing that is present in all of these places that is influencing the cultural transformation, I should say the cultural regression, is the American Evangelical Church. Okay, so let's actually talk about Uganda, a place where the Ford Foundation works and makes grants. It is everywhere in that country. And its influence is astounding. The ability where across the continent, model legislation is just being given to parliamentarians. Fill in the blank for your country. To actually criminalize one's humanity. Same goes for Latin America. And so we, in this country, have to actually call that out. But we have to also look in the mirror at our complicity in getting us to this moment. Because we progressives have played down the importance of religion, have not understood the connection between religious values and cultural values. And in our secularism, have simply ceded the issue of morality to them. Because what is happening is deeply immoral. And to me, as a Christian man, I am outraged that the name that is being used to direct, to guide people's decision making. It's truly shocking. But shame on us, including the Ford Foundation, for not understanding this. But it is not too late. But unless we also understand culture and meet people where they are, we are not going to make progress.
Reach. That was powerful. That was extremely powerful. We are just out of time, but Monica, I wanna end with you. I know there was something really important you wanted to say, and I wanna ask you, how does your background as an Indigenous, in Indigenous grant making, and your background as an Indigenous woman, how does that inform the work that you do around this issue here at Ford?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. I would say, I mean, the first thing is by recognizing that violence doesn't happen to me individually, but it's happening to all of us in a collective manner, to the communities that we are part of. When we are poor, when we don't have access to education, when we don't have access to the right to choose, when we don't have access to give our children an opportunity, it's happening to all of us. So I would say that's the first thing. And the second thing that I wanted to tell you is that, and some of you might have heard me say this before because I was in the Women's Funding Network conference. Today in the Mayan calendar is the day of the Aipu, and the Aipu is the day of justice. It's the day where we regain equilibrium. Yesterday was the day of bringing to life all the dimensions of femininity. So I want to ask you to remember that today is about thinking about the future, the way we are going, and how we are going to regain that equilibrium for the next 7 generations that we have ahead of us.
Incredibly powerful.
Anti-violence movements. Tehran Burke of Me Too International, Aminata Kamara from the Black Tuesday movement in Sierra Leone, Mariam Mangera of South Africa's total shutdown, joined by journalist and author Paula Ramos.
Right, these are all incredible leaders that have helped inspire, spark, fuel different movements. From here in the United States to South Africa, Sierra Leone. Obviously, there's a lot of folks that aren't here today, but I say that because all of these movements obviously transcend borders. These are stories that are not local, they're not national, they are global stories based on shared universal values of justice and equality, and as you say, Toronto, stories that are rooted in action and in healing. And I think that's a core part of why we're here today. We don't have that much time at all. We have about 20 plus minutes, so we're going to, so we're going to look at the past a little bit. We'll focus on the present, and then we'll look ahead. We'll try to do that as fast as we can. And so I'm going to start with you, Brian. In 2006, you started Me Too, and Me Too starts as this idea of offering healing to Black survivors. You wanted them to be seen, you wanted them to be heard. And then suddenly in 2017, we all remember, you see the Me Too hashtag go completely viral. In almost taking a direction that seemed a little bit something that you may have not anticipated in that moment. So, right. So that's all you have right there. I want to lean on that. Now, looking back, how were you able to face the challenges of ensuring that Me Too came back to its original mission, right? Take us back to 2017.
Well, hello. Fresh off the cellar. Yeah, you know what? I've had 6 years now to think about that, and I get asked this question all of the time.
I had to.
Yeah, well, no, it's fine. I think it's an appropriate question. I think the appropriate answer to that, I've answered that many different ways. But I think that the the work that I started in the early 2000s was to fill a gap, right? There was a gap in our community. There was nobody really dealing with survivors. There was nobody dealing with sexual violence in a way that, so these girls were slipping through the cracks. And there were no resources in the community, but also nobody was saying things like healing is possible, and it's not your fault, or that you have a voice. Those kind of things were missing. The same thing happened in 2017, right? On a massive scale. And so I don't think the mission changed in 2017. I think it got bigger and it got amplified. And the genie's jumped out of the bottle and couldn't be put back in. And so what I think my role became, what my job became, was to make sure that the people who I started focusing on didn't get lost. The mission didn't change. But what happened is that once everybody's focus, was like, oh, wait a minute, we have to pay more attention to this, look at all the people. Of course, they're not going to pay attention on where I started it. And so, somebody created a center and told us that was a center and then pushed us to the margins of a center that we didn't even read. And so, my job became to make sure that those of us who get pushed to the margins get focused on. But the mission of the work has never really changed. When Me Too went viral, we saw that those same resources were needed, those same gaps existed, and the healing was necessary and the action was necessary.
Very quickly before we dive into other movements, what was your reaction in 2017 when Me Too was viral? Like, what do you remember thinking of that?
Hopeful. It was hope.
What about you?
It was the people that are affected. It was the survivors and hope as well, just to move forward.
That's right,
Yeah.
Miriam, I want you to take us to South Africa. It's August 2018. What are the different elements that led to Torisha? Take us to that one.
So 1st of August was when everything exploded, because that was the day that started Women's Month. It was also the day that we planned to protest, but there was a build-up to that. The total shutdown movement organically occurred because we had a number of activists on social media that had been calling for change for a number of years. And there were small flare-ups, small viral moments, but nothing took. So what had happened in April of 2018 is that it was the 1-year commemoration of the death of Karabo Mokwena, who was a beautiful young woman who was killed and then her body set alight by her boyfriend. And a year later, justice had not been served. So that was the point where we said enough is enough. And we're talking about a country that based its laws on oppression and dividing people. So it can't be shocking that the same country did not protect its women. And so our safety has always been in jeopardy. And in 2018, it marked 24 years of democracy. So what we did was, for the 1st of August, is we planned to hand over a memorandum of demand to all the strategic national points of power in the country. So it went to the president at the Union Buildings, the parliament, and to the Supreme Court of Appeal. But then we ensured that we didn't leave any women behind. So we then had additional protests happening across the country to make sure that women from all walks of life could be included, and we made it a safe space. So not just our online platforms, but also the marches and the protests of the day were free of men. It was only women and LGBTQI plus communities.
And then about a year after that happens, we ended in Sierra Leone, right, where there's a similar movement that takes place, this time sparked by the brutal rape of a 4-year-old girl. Take us there. Now, how did that rage that was felt across the country sort of turn into the birth of the movement?
So So in 2018, we had numbers going up regarding rape and sexual penetration. Over 8,500 cases of rape, and in that, 2,000 plus minors being the victims and survivors of that. But one incident that sparked the movement is a 5-year-old who was raped by a relative and got paralyzed. So people were angry, people were out, they were talking about this violent pandemic that was upon us. And one of a very outstanding media guru in Sierra Leone, Asma James, asked that people wear black in grief of this epidemic that is upon us, to mourn people who have lost their lives as a result of rape, and to be on the streets, or to talk, to bring everyone together in a town hall to talk about rape and the crisis of rape that we're facing as a country. So we're in this room talking about it, and then we're like, let's just march, because we're in the center of town. We have the Ministry of Justice, we have the State House, we have met in the center of Freetown. So we're like, let's just march and show our outrage to these people. So while we embarked on this march, students were there, activists were there, movement organizers were there. We're like, how do we move this beyond just the days organizing? How do we look at systemic reform? Because every day a girl gets raped, every day a girl is sexually harassed and penetrated. How do we move from just looking at and zooming at a one incident, but the entire systemic reform? So we're constantly engaging communities on rape, because we realize that a lot of secrecy is around the issue of rape and sexual penetration in Sierra Leone. Survivors were shushed not to talk about their encounters, not to face and remove the shame that is so ingrained in the system. So we're like, let's go to the community, let's talk about it. Some of us who were leading the work in Sierra Leone at that moment were also survivors ourselves. So when they do victim blaming, let's just tell them there's a face to this. There was a survivor. I am one of them, despite all what I've been through in life and thriving. So we removed a lot of those myths around surviving sexual and gender-based violence, bringing faces, having testaments, and reporting. We did a lot of media engagement. So this caught the attention of the presidents. Every day they would hear news. The numbers were coming up because people knew that they can't be ashamed anymore. They cannot hide this underneath, let's just settle this at home. It was now people coming forward and sharing their stories and reporting. So the numbers were even multiplying by the day. And this brought the attention of the president to declare a state of emergency against rape and sexual penetration and rape provisions. As a result of this particular movement, we were also able to look at our laws. There were a lot of loopholes in our laws at that moment, where minimum conviction rates were at the discretion of judges. We even had an encounter where someone was sentenced to 72 hours in prison after they've gone through the legal procedures and hearings and presenting all of the proofs and facts to the matter, just being sentenced to 72 hours because the judge took it upon themselves as their discretion, and the law permitted it. So we took a lot of diving into the laws of Sierra Leone at that moment, the Sexual Offences Act, to look at the loopholes that exist in the system. Service providers, we had a little or minimal service provision for sexual survivors at the moment. We had someone from Rainbow Initiative who provides medical and psychosocial support, and little support from the government really on zooming in on survivors. So just looking at all of those systems, how the systems were not serving the people, even though people were now aware, they can talk about rape, they can come and share their stories boldly without being ashamed, without being afraid, but then the systems were not serving them. So we zoomed in on the systems to see how do we strengthen this and engage. A lot of lobbying was done with our politicians, our governments, to just say how do we even do better for the people and the girls of Sierra Leone. And the law, the Sexual Offences Act was revised, and we had a minimum sentence rape of aggravated sexual act against a child and girls and women in Sierra Leone. And we had people could be sentenced to 15 years in prison. So there were improved provisions made. They were talking about emergency hearing, which was a struggle as well. When it comes to the legal, the system was just not functional at that moment. So I think
that's an interesting point, right? I think for in these three cases, I know that the Sexual Offense Act was amended. I know, for instance, that after the total shutdown, that helped lead to one of the first gender-based violence conferences in the continent. And obviously in the United States, we started thinking about accountability and having conversations in different ways. Perhaps, did that actually lead to cultural change? Like, how do you even measure that, right? Because, and I come across this conversation all the time, we can have policies in place, we can have legislation in place, and if the system still doesn't work, to your point, how do you measure that change?
See, this is, I'm listening to both of you speak, and what I find really interesting is when people listen to stories from other countries about sexual and gender-based violence in America, there's always this, not always, but there's this sentiment about, oh my gosh, this tragedy happening in Africa, right? Oh my God, they're raping 4-year-old children in Africa. They're burning the women alive in South Africa. That happens in America, right? But in America, when Me Too went viral, and you had millions of people, there were 12 million responses to the Me Too hashtag in 24 hours across social media, right? That is human beings. That is people responding saying, this happened to me. Across this country. We have statistics that mirror everything that you can say that's happening in African countries, in countries that we like to call oppressed, that oppress women, are happening right here in America. And yet, we have this outpouring of sympathy and talking about what's happening, and it's tragic, obviously, what's happening in other countries, but we don't have the same response in America. I can run down statistics of every state in this country of just as horrific. I can give anecdotal stories just as horrific of these stories, but it does not move people to the streets. The problem in this country is that we do not see sexual violence as a social justice issue, and it is. We do not see sexual violence as a public health crisis, and it is. Anything that happens every 68 seconds is a public health crisis. We have laws on the books in every state in this country. We have laws on the books against sexual violence. But the problem is when you have governors and lawmakers who are signing those laws into making them official with one hand and then running their hand down somebody's back to harass them with the other, what difference does it make? There's not you need a cultural shift. You need multiple interventions in order for there to be a cultural shift. In order to be a measurable change around sexual violence globally, but certainly in America.
Let me ask you really quickly, because you talk a lot about the importance of having grace through this whole process. Even myself as a journalist, navigating today is almost like I don't know how to do my job. You know, being in front of how do I combat misinformation? How do I combat an issue like this that has become so politicized? And I'll ask all of you really quickly, how do you navigate that? And I know you've mentioned the politics of grace, but how do you step into these spaces with grace after having seen me to become so politicized?
I have a different concept of grace. And this is, I'm being a little bit, I don't want y'all to read my book and then be like, oh, she was advertising, but my next book is called, my next book is called Revolutionary Grace. And it's because I think we need grace with discernment. I think we need to practice grace. I think the book is about the idea of what does grace look like with a political analysis, right? With a power analysis. Because those of us who have the least are always asked to give the most, right? Those of us, the problem is that when a woman oftentimes, and I'm going to use a gender example for this, for what I'm about to say. When a woman stands up to tell her story, the problem is that, this is not just a man-woman thing, oftentimes what people hear is a man's life being ruined, and not a woman's life being saved. If we can operate in grace and hear the difference in that, then we can make a incident around sexual violence, right? It's the questions that we answer first. If we can find the type of grace that says, this is not about her trying to ruin somebody, but about her trying to save herself, is when we shift the dynamic. So the grace that I operate in is trying to find who has the least of this, who needs this grace the most. That's where I start first, right? It's not about trying to ruin somebody, it's about trying to save the people who need it the most. The people who said Me Too were not thinking about the people, they were oftentimes not thinking about who did it, but about themselves. Because they have permission now to save themselves. That's where we start first. So the grace that I'm operating in and operating from is from a place that says, we have to save these people. What do we owe the people who said Me Too? We owe them an opportunity to heal. We owe them an opportunity to save themselves. The people who have been hiding in the shadows and holding this inside of their bodies for 30 and 40 and 50 years, that's who deserves grace first. But the problem is, we've all been socialized to save the people who are, what about the people who didn't mean it? What about the gray areas? What about the false accusations? I'm not saying those things don't deserve some light. I'm talking about we start with the least of these, right? And that's part of the problem. We have a global pandemic on our hands. And every other issue that we have to deal with, every other issue. If we want to deal with gun violence, if we want to deal with racial violence, if we want to deal with all the other types of violence that we have on our hands, we have to address sexual violence. We cannot truthfully and adequately deal with the other issues that we're dealing with in this world without talking about and including sexual violence. It's dishonest.
And dealing with that also requires investments and funds. And
Come on, let's talk about it. In the right place.
We'll do real time really quickly. Because I feel like often after these viral moments, then there's this silence, that almost haunts you. And people forget, and then it becomes viral again, and we do the little clickbaits, and then we care again. Do you all have the money that you need right now to continue building on it?
I'll go. Our approach as members of the movement in Sierra Leone, purposeful, basically, is that the Calvary is not coming, that we're our saviors. And as movement organizers, mostly, we don't focus on the money when starting the movement, when working, when amplifying that movement. But money is very essential, and not just money, flexible money. When we were doing Black Tuesday movement, if we did not have funders who were not bringing terms and conditions to the grants that we had, we would not have been able to provide fast medical services for survivors. We would not have been able to provide emergency housing to evacuate people who were at risk, who are being threatened by perpetrators. We would not have been able to provide psychosocial support. It got to a moment where we needed money, and the only money we could get was flexible funding. So if you are bringing money and bringing all the terms, the hardest conditions to get that money, you're taking away from the movement. You're taking our time to invest in promoting the needs of survivors, to following your procedures to getting grants. That is not what we want. We want flexible money, but also we're not waiting. We're taking action. As a movement in Sierra Leone, when we realize that a lot of reports are coming up, how do we fund this movement? How do we sustain this? We opened up a pool of funding by Sierra Leoneans, where students were contributing, where activists were contributing money to say, let's provide life-saving and life-essential services for survivors and victims of rape and sexual penetration. We're not waiting for donor funds, but we need it. We need flexible funding. We don't want the headache.
Is that white middle-aged men control the bank accounts, and you're talking about issues that don't affect them. So money is always a challenge today when we're talking about violence against women and children and gender non-conforming persons. In South Africa, we have a very difficult position because of state capture. And if we look back to the political challenges that have faced us, we have many foreign donors that initially were funding gender-based violence and including the sheltering services, now do not fund us any longer because they feel that corruption has been so rife in the country, money should have been allocated towards these services. So we're sitting with people essentially posing sanctions on victims of abuse because they are upset with our government. We do not have money to run a movement. When we were mobilizing for the total shutdown movement, all of the money we had was our own personal money. Nobody gave us funds. So, like for instance, the day of Karabo Mokwenya's anniversary of her death, we were in Soweto mobilizing people to join us for the march. All of our money went on taxi fare to get there. So that afternoon for lunch, we ended up only having coins to buy candy. And that is the essence of what it is to be an activist in South Africa.
I just need to say this. I know we're out of time. But funders need to stop thinking about global sexual gender-based violence as a trend. This is not a trend. When Me Too went viral, unlike other things that went viral, right? When Black Lives Matter was the thing, and people felt guilty because they can see bodies in the street. There were videos, there were things that pulled at people's heartstrings and said, we had to do something about this. And they figured out ways to shift and move money to the streets, because they saw that and they understood that as a continuation of the civil rights movement, of movements that they understood. I have been told by funders to my face that they don't see this as a movement. They don't have an analysis for this as a movement. They don't understand as a movement. What you have to do for the funders in the room or who will see this, you need to reimagine what you know as a movement. You're not going to see the wins that you're used to. You have to trust us. You have to trust survivors because we're the ones who are leading this movement. You're not going to get your front page headlines anymore. Now that Me Too is out of the headlines the way it was 6 years ago, you have to trust that we are building a forward-moving, forward-thinking, survivor-led movement, and you have to rearrange your portfolios. Survivor justice is reproductive justice. Survivor justice is racial justice. It is gun violence. It is mass incarceration. It is climate change. It is in everything that you're doing. So this is not a trend. You can't wait to the next big scandal to try to move a couple of dollars towards sexual violence. If you really care about all of these issues, know that they are interconnected. Y'all love to use, what is the word in love? Intersectionality. Y'all use it all the time. If you want to think about intersectionality, think about the intersections of where sexual violence meets all of these other issues and open up your portfolios because you rearrange them for every other thing. Rearrange those portfolios and uncomplicate it because you can. You do it when you want to.
But I did hear, wasn't it just your birthday? Yeah. Thank you. We have another surprise. I was just told that we have another special guest that is in the building. We were told this morning, and so we got a little bit of an understanding of the situation in Sierra Leone. Not enough, but we sort of were grounded there. And the way that Black Tuesday is leading to change. But now, I am so honored to announce that Her Excellency, Dr. Fatima Bada Bio, the First Lady of the Republic of Sierra Leone, is with us today. So let's welcome her.